Hello, this is Statler Smith. You are watching one installment of a weekly series where I write an essay about something that's on my mind, record myself speaking that essay, and then upload that video to YouTube. For reasons set forth in the initial video in this series, this is a practice for myself. As such, this video will likely not be entertaining or particularly educational. Perhaps one day I will have value to add to others, but in the words of Aragorn, King of Gondor, it is not this day. If you choose to keep watching, feel free to give feedback on the clarity of thought and speech, as that is what I am trying to improve. Please let me know if you have undergone a similar journey or have tips to share. And who knows, maybe I will eventually add more video editing. With that, let's get into this week's essay.
Are rich people automatically evil? Let's take a look. Through discussions with people close to me and a general awareness of some of the current cultural narrative, I've encountered a few reasons as to why rich people are seen as inherently evil. The categories of the reasons I've seen are usually related to structural, systemic frustrations or the personal moral failings of those with money. Before diving into the details of some of the underlying reasons, I want to define what I mean by somebody being rich. For this discussion, I'm going to include people with a high net worth from all sorts of assets. That includes cash, that includes stocks, bonds, all of that is what I'm considering included in the net worth of an individual. Of course, this does not include people with high assets but high debt, because I'm looking at net worth here, not gross worth. So if somebody has a lot of debt but a lot of assets, kind of cancel each other out a bit. So I'm not including those. Personally, I think the morality is a little bit different based on the composition of the assets. So, for example, if your wealth is all in cash or all in stocks, all in equity, all in businesses, all in real estate, etc., I think the implications for morality are a little bit different with each of those compositions. But for this discussion, I'm just going to lump all of those into wealth. So, first off, I mentioned that there were structural issues. One of the arguments that relates to one of those structural issues is the like tax strategies that are completely legal. One of them I've heard of recently is buy, borrow, and die. And what that means is people who own a lot of assets, right? Let's say I'm going to use stocks for this one, just basic equities. Let's say that I own $100 million worth of Apple stock. I don't, but that'd be nice. Um, when I'm older, in fact, I don't need to be older for it. I can borrow against that, right? I can use that equity as collateral for a loan, and I can use that loan to fund my life. So I don't need to sell the stock. I don't need to realize the gains, right? When I sell the stock, I would realize the $100 million worth of, well, I don't know if I would, not all of that is capital gains, right? But I would realize whatever I did gain from owning that stock, and that would be taxed. But if I take a loan against it, that loan is not taxed. And then, so I borrow to fund my life, whatever I need to do with that, and then I die. And what happens when I die? Of course, I don't think the loans go away. However, the when the estate is passed to my kids, the cost basis of the equity I own is shifted to what it is when I die. Now that's a little bit of a technical finance term. Let me give an example. If I bought a stock of Apple when it was worth $10, right? So I bought at $10. It grows to $100. If I sell at $100, then the difference between what I bought it and what I sold it was my capital gains. When I bought it, that's called the cost basis. When I sold it, that's the value. When I sold, that's the realized gains. So the capital gains for tax purposes is the amount that I sold it for minus the cost basis or what I bought it for. So that $90 is all capital gains, and that is all taxed. So with this strategy, the buy, borrow, and die, if I never sell, but instead the ownership, the stocks, passes to my heirs when I die, the cost basis changes. So again, let's say I bought at $10, it went up to $100, but I never sell. Instead, I just die. Well, the cost basis for my kids is now $100 because that's when they received it. So this strategy avoids a lot of tax. Well, I guess it depends on how much the actual value of the stock grows. Um, but because the change in cost basis, then the that capital gains is never taxed. So that's the buy borrow die strategy and a little bit of of course, if I understand it right. I am not, I have not passed my Series 7. I did not, yeah. So from what I understand from reading online, that's the buy borrow die strategy and how the people can avoid taxes by using that strategy. There's one piece that I don't quite understand yet is how they pay it off, right? So if I have that 100, if I take a loan out against that equity, I still need to pay off a loan, right? And still accruing interest and whatnot. And I think a lot of times people look at the strategy and they're like, oh, they're just living like billionaires um, without ever having to pay taxes. And that doesn't quite make sense to me because they still need to pay off the loan. How do they pay it off? With realized gains of some sort. So they're not avoiding all taxes, right? If they pay off the loan, they need to realize some income somewhere, and that income is taxed. Of course, again, that's how I understand it. Um, I don't know if there are ways around that. I mean, if you take the loan out and then invest it again and use the proceeds from your investments to pay off the interest and the debt, um, and still have left over to live, but that feels like then the only thing that you're living off of is the difference between the tax rate and no difference between the interest rate of the loan and the income minus what you're being taxed on. So I don't know. It feels like there's some items there that I don't fully understand um, because you would still need to pay off the loan, and the only way it would make sense is if the interest rates on the loan versus the tax rate is pretty drastically different. Anyways, before I go too deep, right? This isn't to examine the buy borrow die strategy in particular. So before I go too deep, I want to examine the reasoning behind why this is seen as immoral. With this particular strategy, of course, I've seen a couple of arguments that are similar with the ones before. There's the structural, or the structure disproportionately benefits those who already have wealth. That's number one, and therefore it's unfair and unethical. And then two, the people who use this strategy are just trying to get out of paying their taxes and they're trying to avoid their responsibility, and that's unethical. So the first argument is that the legal structure in this case disproportionately benefits those who already have wealth. Um, because this is only feasible for those with enough wealth to borrow against, right? I currently only have like $10,000 in the stock market, not including like 401ks, and it would be terrible for me to take a loan out against that to try and fund my lifestyle because I would, yeah, that is not nearly enough for it to work. So, um, and if you have like a large amount of real estate or investment holdings, banks are a lot more likely to lend you that money with a lower interest rate, right? And I think this particular one is it would be borrowing on margin. Um, and there are certain requirements to even have a margin account, right? You need to be like a qualified investor or all those other things. So you need to have a lot of money before you can even qualify for that strategy. So therefore, the law has different outcomes for different people, and that's unfair. But then how does that impact the individual who has wealth? Well, um, this takes a few more steps. If the law is unfair, well, who created the law? The idea is that wealthy people influence the law or the lawmakers to keep laws like this in their favor. And so this plays into, yeah, the larger concept of the people who have a lot of wealth can essentially decide what is law and what is not. This argument breaks down a little bit because wealthy people aren't homogenous. There are wealthy people who go for one law, wealthy people who go for another law, and assigning the blame and moral responsibility of an entire system on an individual person who has wealth is it's a little bit of a stretch for me. One wealthy person is not responsible for the actions of all the others, right? Now, the second argument for this has to do with the people who use this strategy. If somebody uses the buy, borrow, die strategy, um, the the argument is that they are just trying to avoid taxes, get out of responsibility, and not pay their fair share like the rest of us. Um, I have mixed feelings about this argument. I mean, on the one hand, I really don't like people trying to avoid responsibility, even though I do it sometimes. I try to be fairly duty oriented, even though I do attempt to avoid responsibility at times, but I don't claim it's good. That makes sense. Um, in this instance, I'm not a huge fan of trying to avoid the responsibility of paying your taxes. Um, this whole kind of orientation towards expecting others to adhere to what I think they should be doing has been beaten out of me a little bit because I consider a lot of things a personal responsibility. The most controversial one probably being that I think it's a responsibility for people for the society that they're in to have children to perpetuate that society, right? That's controversial. And I have, um, I don't say that very often. Because, like, I know that everybody has a different situation. I know that not everybody wants to, and they can contribute in other ways, right? And so there are so many workarounds for that I've heard for that one that I don't really judge people now based on whether they have kids. Do I still think that it's a responsibility to contribute to the society that you grew up in? Yeah. Um, but I don't think people are evil if they are trying to avoid that strategy because I know lives are complicated. And so in this case, like if somebody uses the buy borrow die strategy, well, I would have to look into the reasons why. Um, if somebody has amassed that wealth through a lot of work, right? I know like massive wealth can only be um, achieved through a lot of luck, but a lot of work as well. You can't achieve massive wealth with no work. You can't achieve and maintain massive wealth with no work. Um, So, I mean, for good reason, a lot of the people who have massive wealth are very well versed in finance. They are very well versed in ROI and making sure that their actions have a positive impact. And when you compare that with how the government spends money, I would not be surprised if a lot of people who have wealth don't want to give the government their money because they know that they can spend it better than the government can. They can use it to help more people than the government can. Um, so, I mean, people who use the buy borrow die strategy, the motivations aren't set in stone, and I don't presume to know all of them. So that's that's my back and forth on whether or not they're shirking responsibility, or whether or not yeah, that's my back and forth on whether or not they're shirking responsibility. On the other hand of this argument though, where people don't like it because they are avoiding paying their taxes like the rest of us, I can sometimes feel a little bit of entitlement and moral superiority, right? If somebody uses that strategy, then that means that the rest of us don't have we have fewer tax dollars to work with, and we deserve those tax dollars because we can use them better because I want what they have. With this argument, it's difficult to toe the line between having a reasonable solid argument and not being envious, right? Again, I think it can be done, but I it's rare. It's rare. And that's kind of where this is all going in the end. Like there's right and wrong, and then comparing this choice with that list of what is right and what is wrong. Um, some of the main ideas I have in this space is that there is a sense of responsibility that we have as humans to our society, um, and using the buy borrow die strategy seems to avoid some of that responsibility. And to the degree that they are intending to avoid that responsibility, I would consider their character weakened. At least I would trust them less. I mean, I also have responsibilities I don't fulfill though. So I'm not always kind. I'm not great at reaching out to others. If I had that wealth, would I use it better? Um, or like I mentioned before, would the government use it better? Which is questionable. Um, So my 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 policy is before I go about being mad at highly visible people, I wonder if the world wouldn't be a little bit better if I looked at myself first, right? When I've done that, my world has been better. I don't know if anybody else's world has been better, but my world has been better when I look inward first, see what I can do to change, and then try to be the change that I want to see in the world. I know that's really cheesy, um, but my life has been better when I try to do that. So cheesy, sure, but I like cheese. Um, so in summary, I don't personally think that wealth has a bearing on morality. I think it's a tool that can be used to lift people up or tear people down. Um, I think it's a tool that magnifies the character you already have. So somebody with flaws and wealth will have those flaws magnified by that wealth. Somebody with flaws and no wealth, nobody's going to know. So nobody's going to care. So that is my week's reflection. Let me know what you think. Until next week.